Speaking of reliability, a podcast with good friends talking with you about reliability engineering topics. Welcome to Speaking of Reliability. This is Fred Schenkelberg.
And this is Chris Jackson. And we're going to talk about EV batteries in particular, or I suppose rechargeable batteries more broadly, specifically those that have been found to last longer when being used by customers in the real world compared to what the laboratory tests originally predicted.
What I found interesting, it was like, it's good news for EV battery, people, rechargeable battery folks. And they went into the difference between the way the lab tests it and the way it's actually used in the field is kind of the gist of their paper. And the batteries could last significantly longer than expected by the lab testing. And then my immediate thought was, I've been on this a couple of different times where the lab testing was said, it'll last for 40 years. And then 2 years in, there's all kinds of problems. And it was actually for the same failure mechanism that they were testing in the lab. It was just that the lab testing was doing it so benignly that they fooled themselves that it would last a long time. And then vice versa. The lab tests for the EV batteries, and I've seen it being done, is they do a rapid discharge and then a rapid charge, and which is in one regard considered conservative because there are use cases where your car is being used as a taxi 24/7 and it gets discharged hard through the day, and then it gets a rapid charge, and then it's back on the road real quick. But that's not how most people drive. And I think that was the gist of the story, is that depending on how you stress your batteries, it may last a lot longer.
And the same goes for cell phones or mobile phones as well. Battery life's a very important consideration. And it's not even just understanding how people use batteries. It's also understanding how people recharge batteries, because you need to. There's all sorts of different, trickle feed this, and all the other different ways of recharging batteries, which aren't really particularly well understood because it's all about chemistry. People just think you just throw electricity into a battery and it just captures everything and stores it for later use. And that's part of the story, but not all of it.
It's pretty complicated, what's actually going on in different battery technologies. That's true.
And we're moving into an era where perhaps we'll be able to charge car batteries using flux recharging or flux charging, where you're able to essentially drive along a highway and have big coils underneath it recharging your vehicle as you go.
Yeah, I saw that a couple of years ago. People were proposing doing that, and I'm like, where are they going to find all the metal to do that? We're already, having shortages of copper and having shortages of copper and stuff like that. And like, where are we going to get all this stuff? That's a lot of infrastructure.
It'd be not too dissimilar to railway tracks.
Oh yeah, no, I agree. We're not building a lot of railways, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your position on that. It's I just look at the electrification of the roadways as, well, that'd be cool. But didn't we do that in the 1920s with trolleys and trams and cable cars, stuff like that, where we basically used electrical power to move vehicles around, and then we dismantle that so we could sell more combustion engines. Imagine if we would have kept all that stuff.
Right, it's more culture. I mean, you go to Switzerland, and tell you what, it's way more comfortable traveling from A to B on trains than it is in vehicles. It's like night and day.
Yeah.
You can live on one side of Zurich and commute to and work in Lucerne quite easily, and that's a long distance, which would be prohibitive in many other cities or countries. But it's an absolute delight. But that's because Switzerland very bravely, as a country in the mid-70s, decided this is what we're going to do. with some opposition, to be clear, but now everyone
Yep.
sees that was a wise investment. So, and then you go to other countries where, if only you just take this half seriously, people should come flocking back. But no, it's not where it needs to be. But I suppose going back to batteries, though, I mean, but it's not just batteries, though. So many things are tested in laboratory conditions. And you're right. We usually assume laboratory conditions are often understating the stresses of the real world. Often this is because of semi-deliberate negligence, where people don't want their brand new baby to fail during that last qualification hurdle.
Or they're following the standard to the letter, and the stresses really don't even apply to the product. It's not thinking through what are we actually evaluating. I think there's some I've seen out there that do that. But let's say it's somebody that listens to the podcast. They're like, "Oh, we'd never do that. We know better." And I think another one that this article is talking about is they said, "Well, we want to accelerate this, and we know that the charging discharge cycle is a failure mechanism. So we're interested in how many charge recycles can this battery withstand." And they equated that to life. And then they said, well, and they may even know from their own use of their own electric vehicles or their own surveys of potential customers, is that I just need it to go to work and back, and it's 20 miles, and I plug in when I get to work and I plug in when I get home. It never goes below 80% or 70% or something like that. I just don't burn it a whole lot. And then the engineers kind of got a hold of that and said, well, if we discharge it, halfway and then recharge it, it's going to take us a lot longer to find out how many cycles it can withstand. So we'll do the worst case. We'll do the most damaging set of stresses on purpose to be conservative. And I've seen and heard that article or argument many times as well. If we do this kind of activity and we make it a little bit more stressful, let's say on the 90th percentile or on the max stress, one, the test goes faster. Two, is we're conservative, that if it lasts long enough under those conditions, it'll be fine in the field. And so I'm going to give the EV battery folks that they went conservative on purpose because of the number of unknowns, and just said, right, we're going to say it's going to go 5,000 cycles or whatever the number is they claim. And if you get better than that, well, you might be happy. That's okay.
No, I agree. I think it's not. There's nothing wrong with being deliberately conservative during testing in an informed way. Yeah. So I suppose you say giving the EV team credit because the presumption is that they know that it's not going to be what it needs to be. So they know that the most rigorous way to torture a battery is to fully discharge it and recharge it. And so that's what they do in testing to then sort of represent the 99th percentile use case in terms of stress. Mm-hmm. You're right. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, if there's unknowns, that's exactly what you want to do. Within reason, you don't want to make it torturous unnecessarily to try and make it, which will essentially make it difficult to pass.
Makes it a halt test at that point. And then you want failures. But I think what they get the credit for is that there's a lot and I've worked with one team that was working with batteries, and there's some smart people that know the chemistry and where the damage mechanisms are and stuff like that. And they go, yeah, when you fully discharge and you fully recharge quickly, do a rapid recharge, that is very stressful for the battery and its chemistry and how well it will maintain a set level of discharge. The batteries degrade. Instead of getting, I'll just make up numbers, 600 miles, 600 kilometers out of a charge, you get 550 after so many charge and discharge if it's damaging. And if you do it very lightly, you'll probably get more out of it. So we know the mechanism. We know that this is the most severe damaging for it. But if that charge discharge cycle has nothing to do with how long that capacitor lasts, that's controlling the charge discharge cycle, and that capacitor fails for temperature reasons, for example, or some other reason, then the test is pretty invalid. But the folks
Yeah.
I've run into really do understand, and there's a lot of papers out there, there's a lot of technical detail out there about that, especially the lithium ion batteries, is what works and what doesn't work with those things.
Well, yeah, it's so I suppose what's the point of the conversation? It's just that the scenario we're responding to is that, yes, after testing the way we described for electronic vehicle batteries, we found out that no, the predicted durations or lives of the batteries is less than the actual life because humans are using it in a way which is better, which is good news.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the takeaway for me, Chris, is that you got to, one, and I think you hit it on the head, is you got to understand how your stresses is actually applying damage or increasing the chance of failure or whatever in any accelerated test. It doesn't matter what it is. You need to understand what it is you're doing and how does it actually manifest in the product itself. Given that, then it's how do you, it's more of the management and marketing folks, is that do we want to have a headline in a paper, 3 months or 10 years from now saying, oh, your battery will last 40% longer because most people don't use it the way we tested in the lab, which is a missed marketing opportunity. They could have said 50% of our expected users will have a battery life that'll go, for 15, 20 years instead of 10 years. It gets mixed in with the marketing. It gets mixed in with engineering. Do we need to make it better? Because solving the problem of how well it charges and discharges at the extremes is a different engineering challenge than it is at the nominal stresses. I have an opinion of which way to go with that, but it's always a trade-off. If and only if, using a mathematical phrase there, you really know the failure mechanism.
Yeah, and I also think that people will say, well, that's the fact that it didn't replicate as well as the real life situation as well as it should have. That's failing on behalf of whoever's putting the test regimes together and the test profiles.
Mm-hmm.
And you could argue there's a case to be answered. However, it's always challenging to model how something's going to be used when the thing that's being used is fundamentally different to the thing that's replacing. You could say that an EV is exactly the same as an internal combustion vehicle in terms of it has 4 doors, steering wheels, and the rest, but
mm-hmm.
It's not. People will modify their behavior based on new devices. A very famous example is the cell phone or mobile phone. And initially that came out as a luxury device, but tradespeople were the ones who adopted that product earlier and more vigorously than anybody else because it saved them time and money. And so as opposed to this being a luxury product, it became a professional product, and the rest is history. And those who didn't take notice don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And same with electric vehicles. It means that a lot of customers are doing it for ideological reasons, purchasing an electronic vehicle or electric vehicle, I should say. And that drives their behaviors. So it's very difficult to predict how customers will use your thing when your thing is actually going to modify behaviors as well. Mm-hmm. So the fact there's uncertainty in the actual real life profile of these things isn't of itself bad. I mean, you could argue about the degree of badness before it becomes truly bad. That's some really cool English I'm using there. But, there's always going to be that uncertainty, especially if your product is a revolutionary one. Smartphones were revolutionary, and they get used in different ways that were just not predictable at the start.
Yeah. Well, same with computers. And even the typewriter. But there's all kinds of considerations when doing any accelerated tests and how it then is interpreted by the public. And the part of that overall communication process is pretty vague. We don't, very, very few vendors and suppliers, even business to business companies, give you the details of how they do their accelerated testing and all of, what they found, what they didn't find, a true accelerated test report versus just, oh, it'll last 20 years, give or take a little bit. And it's, the way you go about doing it, the way you go about doing it is something that you and I and the audience on this podcast would say, well, how did you actually evaluate that? What was the stresses? How was that converted? What was the acceleration factors? What, is there a clear understanding of the failure mechanisms? But we're not the general public. If it says 20 years, then I really expect it to last 20 years. I might forget 19 years from now that it was supposed to last that long. But if I buy the battery range and the degradation of the lithium ion batteries over time and the ability to even charge and discharge it or charge it, all speak to that the early adopters by far were taking a chance. Well, will this get me to the store and back? And then I know I ran into a number of people that bought them because their company would put with a free perk for them. They get an upfront parking spot with a charging station dedicated to them. Like, now it's a cost option. It's that I get free electricity to charge this thing. But the idea is, yeah, there's a lot of unknowns. That's a factor in all of our testing and reporting, but reporting it to the customer gets filtered down to usually a single number or some, hard to piece out what does it really mean. The other part what struck me about this article is that there's the equal headline is, well, it said it would last for 5 years or 10 years, but it only lasts 2 years. And because our testing was too benign or not done at all, or was done very, very poorly. Or the marketing team just said, we're just going to claim 5 years, well, independent of whatever you guys think it is, because you don't really know. And that's a whole different story. It's instead of going, EV drivers will be pleasantly surprised to learn that their batteries are going to last longer. Well, that's true. But if it's EV drivers are going to be unpleasantly surprised because their batteries last half as long as they expected, now that's really bad. So it's both sides of that scenarios needs to be thought through as you set up and run your testing and how you marketed it.
But there is a saying in a lot of business practices that you under promise and over deliver.
Yeah.
And it's typically sage advice. And I think that when it comes to things where there are uncertainties, you do have to be conservative in certain circumstances, but it's being conservative in an informed way. Yep. You can be conservative in that you just say, all right, let's just over-engineer everything. That's one way of being conservative, but that's an awful approach. You could also argue that a conservative approach is working out the 5 dominant failure mechanisms you think are, and then applying the most stressful scenarios to those for those 5 failure mechanisms and coming up with a life, well, basing your service life on those circumstances. That would also be conservative, but in a much more informed way than the simply over-engineering everything. And often when you over-engineer everything, you furiously reinforce the things that weren't going to break anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. No, there's a lot of thinking involved all the way through the process. And I think what makes reliability engineering and accelerated testing and all that stuff interesting is that, yeah, we got to get into the nuts and bolts and chemistry and all that good stuff of what's really going on. So we have an informed decision about how to accelerate it. And in some cases, we're sticking around in that industry or in that product line or that company long enough that we get a 10-year back look at, well, how well did it really do? And then we have an informed decision. Oh, well, we made the right choices there. And here's what we've learned in the meantime. And here's the incremental changes in battery performance. Then we can see that in the field. And those kinds of things just take time. And one point you mentioned is that it's really hard to capture how a person actually uses the product. Even if we really, really know it, it just takes time. That's why we do accelerated testing. If we put a bunch of cars on the road and said, here, just go use them, let us know when the battery gets to 70% capacity, or it doesn't charge as well anymore, it would take us years and years and years to do it. Might be fun, but it's real time slow, hopefully slow for what we're doing.
Well, yeah. And I think there's no answer. I think people are looking for the, it's 42 or something else. It's you got to do this, you got to do that, and off we go. And if you follow the bouncing ball, then everything will be fine. Again, that's not quite how it works. And you have to use that, we keep arguing to use critical thinking.
Yep.
We need to reinforce that again for this conversation. But I suppose we don't even know, let's just say if anyone's done anything wrong with the EV batteries. And when I say wrong, inverted commas wrong, because again, if they're being conservative in an informed way, well, good on them. If they're being conservative because they just didn't care, well, they've missed out on a marketing opportunity. Mm-hmm. So it's all about the mindset you have versus the quantifiable criteria for you to, work out when you're taking this seriously or not.
Well, this is probably a record for us because we're 21 minutes into this podcast. And at this point we say, and what decision are you informing? We just don't run life tests just for the fun of it. What is this? Is it good enough to launch? Is it safe? Is it, what decision are we trying to inform? And that's a factor in it. It's certainly a factor in how we set up and run a task. But I think you're exactly right, Chris. There's more than one factor involved in consideration in it. And there's, at least for EV batteries, we have years and years and years of experience now. And, we know lead acid batteries even better because they've been around for 100 years. And at some point, EV batteries and their technology will settle in on one chemistry technology, and it's good enough for our uses for all the different factors, and we'll have great information about what works and doesn't work, and we'll probably not even do much of testing on them anymore. That's a ways off yet. So in the meantime, we keep learning, and pleasantly for people that have batteries in their car, these lithium-ion batteries, is that the folks that were selling them were under-promising and over-delivering. So it was a good thing. I think that was the gist of this article. So anyway, there's a bunch of thoughts there, but it's we've talked about accelerated testing so many times.
Well, yeah, I mean, to be fair, accelerated life testing, you're actually trying to get that hypothetical calculator worked out for your scenario. But again, it's a calculator that you create for your scenario, not another calculator that's handed to you by someone else who's answered all your questions in advance.
And we're still at the point where differences in geometry, difference in heat dissipation, differences in controller technologies and the circuitry around it all impacts the amount of damage per cycle that occurs on these batteries. So there's a ways to go before we're standardized on these things. But anyway, if you're driving an EV, well, drive a little longer. You're good. Or keep up your behavior because that's good for your battery or whatever. But if you're sitting down to think about how do I interpret my test results, hopefully it gave you a handful of things to think about. If you have any questions on it, or if you have other stories of that where the news headline was the opposite or the same, let us know. Head over to ascendoverliability.com/go/SOR. A couple of ways to get in touch with us. Chris and I and the other hosts of the show are available through LinkedIn and our About pages. The best way to keep your battery going for a long, long time is just don't drive anywhere.
That might not be true because, batteries sitting there aren't happy, but or can be unhappy.
That's true. I'm thinking of cars. They like being driven. It's any car, just all the mechanical parts and lubrication and all the other stuff likes to be used, not sitting in my driveway. So there's some truth to that. But anyway, good luck on all the testing and stuff. And Thanks for the discussion, Chris. I knew that article would spark some thoughts for us.
All right, Fred, always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Speaking of Reliability. We invite you to join the conversation. If you have a question or a topic that you think we should discuss in a future show, please let us know. You can find a comment box below the episode show notes, or just leave a note as part of a review on iTunes.